Hi, in this lecture, we're going to start our study of the special senses. But before we do that, I just want a really quick review with you receptors. So remember that a receptor is a structure that forms a nerve impulse, known as an action potential, as long as you have a threshold stimulus. Remember, they follow the all or none law. The graded potential occurs first, and if it's strong enough, then you get the nerve impulse. That nerve impulse then is formed by the receptor and sent through the afferent or sensory neurons to the CNS for interpretation. So where in the CNS is all this interpreted? Well, we looked at this a little bit when we looked at the brain. Remember, our general senses or sense of touch, that's all processed in that postsensory gyrus. That was called your somatosensory cortex or primary sensory cortex, and that's things like temperature and pain and pressure, and we've already studied that. We are going to focus on the special senses. So for special senses, we have olfaction, which you probably know as smell, gustation, taste, obviously you know vision, equilibrium is basically balance, and then hearing. So as far as olfaction or sense of smell, notice that olfaction or the olfactory cortex is in the temporal lobe, as well as hearing, the auditory cortex. So again, the cortex, these are the areas of the brain that are processing all that incoming information. Whereas taste tends to be in the parietal lobe. Vision is interpreted in the visual cortex, back in the occipital lobe. And then equilibrium or balance is really mainly in the cerebellum. So when we look at our special senses, we have two of them that are chemical senses. So this is taste and smell. And taste and smell use chemoreceptors. So remember, chemoreceptors are receptors that respond to chemicals. Now, for taste, the chemical has to dissolve in saliva. So if you were to dry your tongue off and put some sugar on it, you would not be able to taste it because you have to have saliva in order to taste. Whereas smell, the chemicals have to dissolve in mucus. So both need to dissolve in some sort of medium. When they activate their receptors, they actually complement each other. And in fact, we say usually that taste is roughly 90% smell. And we'll talk more about that as we get into taste. In this lecture, we're going to focus on olfaction or smell. So we have these chemicals, they're called odorants. So an odorant is basically a scent chemical. And there's different types of odorants, but when they come in, they dissolve in mucus and they bind to an olfactory receptor. So they bind to a very specific receptor. And these receptors are very, very sensitive. They have a low threshold because as few as 4 can activate that receptor and form that action potential. Now, in this picture, just to review some anatomy with you, you might remember here's basically your nasal cavity. This thing up here is your olfactory bulb, and these are the holes in the cribriform plate. So remember when you learned the ethmoid bone and you saw all those holes? Notice that these neurons for smell are passing right through those holes. So the receptors are very high up in the nasal cavity. There's 10 to 20 million receptors. So we have quite a few of these. Obviously not as many as a dog. If you look at a dog's nose, right, much, much bigger, many, many more receptors. But the receptors are way up in the nasal cavity. And so this is why if you're trying to smell something, like to smell a flower, you sniff it. And sniffing is going to help draw those odorants way up high so that they can depolarize and form an action potential. And if you look at the neurons, you might notice these neurons are bipolar neurons. Remember that bipolar neurons were the rarest, and they were found and functioned for our sense of smell. And we'll look at them for vision. So here's another view. You can see the blue, the bipolar neurons here. Notice all their axons get bundled, and those bundles of axons pass through that cribriform plate. And that's technically your olfactory nerve, by the way. I'm not going to get too much into the physiology, but just know that when that odorant binds, it works kind of like how you studied the protein hormones. It activates a G protein and causes a chain reaction to occur, which is going to depolarize and form that action potential. So we have the odorant, it binds, we get an action potential, and now we need to send that information up to the olfactory cortex. So those axons, as I mentioned, pass through the cribriform plate in little fascicles or bundles, and that's technically the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1. Now, once they go through that holes in the cribriform plate, they synapse with the olfactory bulb. And you saw this on the brain. I always said they kind of looked like a Q-tip, right? You have the bulb, and then you had the tract. That's a terrible picture. But we had the tract, and we had the bulbs, and we had them on either side. So the bulbs are simply going to transfer the action potential to the olfactory tract, right? Bundle of myelinated axons in the CNS, and then that's going to send the information to the olfactory cortex. So here's the pathway. You can see the air coming in. We depolarize the cell, the bipolar neuron, see the yellow. The axons come up through the cribriform plate where they synapse with neurons in the olfactory bulb. Those axons then leave through the olfactory tract, and they head to a couple places as they come back. Now, they're primarily going to go to the olfactory cortex, and we talked about that in the temporal lobe, so you can process smell, but it also sends it into the hypothalamus and the limbic system. Because remember that we can respond to the emotional aspect of a smell or a danger smell or a fear smell because of that hypothalamus. If it's the middle of the night and you smell smoke, you might activate your fight or flight response. Or maybe when you smell lilac, it helps with your limbic system and helps you to feel calmer. And interestingly enough, some of the odorants actually affect the trigeminal nerve, and it can cause like a burning pain. So if you've ever smelled something really, really strong like bleach and it actually feels like it burns, that's because those affect that nerve instead of the olfactory nerve. As far as olfactory discrimination, we can tell between a whole bunch of different scents. They say that there's about 50 primary smells, which is surprising to me, but we can actually differentiate many, many different types of smells. But as we get older, our sense of smell decreases. So I want to come back to this pheromone thing. You may have heard of this before. So pheromones are basically scent chemicals. And the idea with pheromones is that we all smell, we all have these pheromones, and they say that it allows species to pick up information about us. For example, supposedly there's pheromones that signify being afraid, and they say that dogs or animals can pick up on those. We have pheromones between humans, which basically are the underlying factors for attraction. So when you feel attracted to someone, they say that part of it is due to you like the way they smell. So you may wear your significant other's clothing, or you may, smell their cologne and think of them. And this is a whole science of trying to bottle pheromones and make you irresistible to whoever you're interested in being interesting to. So it's kind of neat. It's the basis of the whole cologne industry, but these pheromones are chemicals or scent chemicals that are released. There was a study I read once where they had a bunch of college students, a bunch of males sweated, worked out in t-shirts. They put the t-shirts in boxes, and they had females come through and sniff them. It sounds disgusting, doesn't it? But supposedly the ones that the certain females would rate, I guess, the smell, and the smells that they found more pleasant actually worked out with their immune systems and were like complementary immune genetics, so that if these two individuals should mate, their children would have a better genetic profile, better immune system. So who knows, maybe deep down we don't think we like how our significant other smells, but maybe we really do, and that's the whole law of attraction. I mentioned as we get older, we do lose our sense of smell, and then we have something called and hypoosmia, which basically anosmia means you can't smell anything at all. So maybe you have damage to your olfactory nerve. I knew someone who, when he was a child, a dog bit him right on the bridge of his nose, and it severed and damaged the olfactory nerve, so he can't smell anything at all. And then hypo always means less than, so you might have a decreased ability to smell. This happens when you have allergies or you have a stuffy nose, and we know it can happen from a COVID infection because it can actually get into the olfactory nerve, but that would be a reduced ability for smell. And remember, if you can't smell, then it usually will affect your sense of taste. If you've had a cold or you can't smell, your food doesn't taste as well or as good either. So that concludes our lecture on olfaction.